All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third Road to JOVED. Today, we're going to be joined by Ilham Akbar. Ilham is the world champion in the EFL category of Thailand Worlds. He's also the JOVED champion in JOVED UGM. And so today, Ilham will be explaining to us on how exactly does competitive debating connect to activism. And we give the floor to you, Ilham.
Okay, thank you, VM. So the reason why we're talking about how competitive debating connects to activism today is because this is Road to JOVED, right? And I hope I can give you insights in terms of why should you compete in JOVED and what should you prepare, what mindset should you be in terms of debating in JOVED. And I think that if we only join debating competition simply for winning, I think that would be something that's pretty difficult, because even though VM told you that, I won Worlds and I won JOVED, both with him, in many other instances, I actually lose and doesn't even get into top 10 speaks. So I guess this is another reason why I debate, which I want to share with you guys. So that you can enter JOVED with a mindset other than just to win or get speaker titles. So I'm going to introduce myself a bit outside of, achievements that VM have told you. Basically, my name is Ilham. I'm currently Minister of Issue Investigation and Local Grassroots Movements at ITB student body. Maybe it's different names in different campuses, like some is BEM, some is like ITB, BEM, like BEM KM UGM. We are also KM ITB. So that's basically it. And my job here is basically to work together with different grassroots local movements in feminism, in poor settlements like slum communities, in like disability communities and things like that, and try to work with them in terms of finding out how we can help in terms of advocating the issues to governments, to socialize their messages towards the public, gain more awareness, things like that. And other than that, the reason why I'm here is also I'm debater at Student English Forum ITB. Now, then the question is why watch this particular video, right? I already told you a bit on the intro, but for me personally, I've often found myself conflicted in my debating career. So oftentimes I have to speak for things I am personally against. So debating, oftentimes you will force yourself to be capitalistic when you're not. You will force yourself to be, edgy, liberal when you're not. For instance, motions will ask you to be people that you are not and try to speak as someone that you are not. And sometimes I also feel that debating is something that's, superficial and pretentious and helping no one, because like we're talking about these like dire issues that are happening in society for the sake of having our names in, in a Heroku app, for instance, or sometimes having prize money. So we're directly profiting from like talking about issues that people on the ground, unless like it's motions that are personal, like we also things like family and things like that, maybe we also personally also experience it. But a lot of motions, we're talking about people that doesn't even have the privilege to actually debating conversation and even be paid or get prize money from these things. So that's why sometimes I feel that maybe this is something that is kind of not, but I should have, with the knowledge that I have spent time other than debating. That's why if you know me personally, for instance, you would know that I often retire and then cancel my retirement, and that keeps on going on in terms of my university debating career. But I'm going to tell you three things why, after reflecting my debating career for like basically 7 years prior to this, why then we should talk about debating in an activism lens. The first thing is about finding purpose, because I think that we need to have a deeper purpose in terms of why we debate and why we join activism, why we tweet, why we Insta story, why we write Medium articles and things that we do as people. Because it's something that's necessary in a complex world. The second thing that I hope you will gain from watching this is that you will be able to learn to listen and balance different interests. Because I will say that I previously hated PP because how complicated it is. And I mean, like, why do you have two benches supporting basically the same thing, but but with different methods, and you have to sometimes frame or knife your opponents just to win. Well, in reality, you're defending the same things. But as I got deeper in terms of like seriously interacting with a lot of activists and communities, like this is something that's actually important because it also happens in real life. And BP benches are basically stakeholders within like real issues on the ground with very different interests and very wide spectrum of interests, while actually they seem like supporting the same things, but they're actually not. And we need to reconcile these things as people on the ground. The third thing is I'm going to talk about providing context, because I think that in the age where debating right now is becoming more about strategy and tactics. Sometimes, in order for us to break through that kind of logic-based battle and strategy-based battle, sometimes our tipping point or competitive advantage that you may find is when we know something a lot and we can bring specific and detailed context, and it becomes something that's very valuable. And in both debating and activism, being able to speak of this particular context in forums and also in debates would be something that's very useful, because it brings realism towards any discussion that you are having. That's basically the three things that can help you in terms of both finding purpose and actually competing within JOVED itself. Okay. So basically, in Asians, it's sort of that world is as black and white. And this is also important because now this is the first time like JOVED turns from Asians to BP. And why I think that this is something that also needs to be celebrated, because I think that although I hated BP at first, I think that BP is more reflective towards the world in which it is not black and white, but it's like various colors, orange, gray, pink, and everything in between. Basically, that should be a mindset. At least I'm going to a BP debate, training myself to be aware of these different nuances of these black and whites, or right or wrongs, or pros and cons, and be more aware of its different spectrums. And the first thing I'm going to do is then tell you about some of the things, the typical things. So it's not like the detailed things, but like and not the detailed issues, but general kinds of issues that I face when I've been a minister, or like before I've become a minister, I independently work together, whether it's from researchers from my campuses or things like that, with communities that have issues that they want to advocate. Basically, you will face a familiar looking kind of chart. So for instance, like when I talk about things that involve activists in terms of and activism in terms of economy, environment, and things like that, maybe like the most hot topic in terms of activism right now would be the omnibus law in Indonesia, and the subsequent related things about indigenous communities laws, about environmental laws, and things like that. Basically, what you will see is a familiar looking chart in which people have very different interests, maybe some of them similar, but very different in terms of the nuance and the strategies that they bring. So if we look at omnibus law, for instance, a lot of the networks of societies would protest on the street, and they would push for redistribution at all costs. Their language is very strong. They want to punish every one of these businessmen with no compromise, and all of these corruptors with no compromise. This is a very different approach that a lot of the international NGOs, World Bank, for instance, in their approach to try to advocate for their interests. So they would do things like publish reports and create deals with governments and businesses, and try to create compromise between economics and environment in terms of the policy briefs that they make to the government and towards the society that they release. That would be people who generally want a more progressive society, a more progressive economy and environment. But on the other spectrum, even people who have interests that are, you may say evil, like the governments and business oligarchs, for instance, they also operate differently, right? So governments, for instance, often create tokenistic public consultations. So they still invite, for instance, members of indigenous communities, members of local communities, when they want to build a mine, when they want to build a new tourism zone, for instance, they would still do things like that. They still look for election, so they still want to look good. They spark populism through media propaganda. They really, if you look at a lot of the issues that are happening, if I have been following a lot of issues, for instance, and I really noticed on how fast the amount of media outlets would report in the side of government the moment there is a press conference from a grassroots community. They would directly be news stations, prominent news stations that would bring titles and interviews with government members that are siding with the government. So these are the things that the strategies that they use, and we need to. And as activists, we often are aware of that and try to, as quickly as possible, track their arguments and so on. The last actor in this, for instance, are business oligarchs, like owners of, mining corporations, paper and pulp corporations, palm oil, and things like that. They usually have more direct in terms of using bribe and force in terms of making sure that their businesses are safe, but they also do things like, and contrary to governments, they never talk. They cover up all possible media leaks. So you won't see interviews with the owners of the palm oil industry, for instance. And they also often have no compromise in terms of maximizing their profit. So they often would always pressure and and are not open towards consultations and compromises. So even in general, whether we destroy the environment or have more profit for corporations kind of thing, in the ground, in which when you are doing activism and you're formulating arguments for you to publish to media, you need to constantly be aware of the different interests. I'm going to go into like case studies later, maybe in terms of details on how to navigate that. But that's the general picture. Another general picture, for instance, if you talk about feminism issues, sexual violence, for instance, you have the grassroots feminists that will protest on the streets, use provocative campaigns, and does not give platform to conservatives to talk at all. So if you see a pattern in terms of how webinars or seminars right now, because that's the strategy that's mainly used right now in COVID, for instance, the sexual violence eradication bill, or RUU penghapusan kekerasan seksual, never would you see a grassroots held webinar inviting someone from, say, the conservative AILA, or that's the the family pro-family kind of community in Indonesia that's very vocal in terms of going against this particular bill, or invite anyone from the parliament that is against the bill. This is different from the way that progressive medias do their job, because often they would have approaches where the infographics that they choose are often objective two-sided reports, very different from the infographics that is published by grassroots feminist organizations. Similarly, in terms of how they air their news, you would often see conservatives airing and debating with members of Komnas Perempuan, for instance, in Kompas TV, in whatever, in different television channels. So there's a different approach in terms of how do you want to convince society? Do you spark a debate, or do you have one-sided webinar where most people agree, right? This is very different strategies that I realized that these different people uses. The right side, I haven't changed it actually. I forgot to finish the presentation, but you get the idea. But basically, parliaments and conservative Muslims also have different ways in terms of what are the arguments that they obtain to say that they are right. So parliament will say that, for instance, one of the populist arguments that the parliament always use, that because this is this is a condition of pandemic, economic growth, and it was a specific context at that time that the commission, the 8th commission that should be dealing with the sexual violence bill, is also dealing with the natural disasters or kebencanaan law, which is a very populist way to say that in terms of pandemic, of course, we have to focus in terms of the disaster law rather than the sexual. So be wary in terms of what kind of arguments would they particularly use with their position that will be most populist or best convene society. Conservative Muslims similarly would cite and paraphrase different parts of the law to say that this is supports LGBT or things like this, supports outside marriage sex, things like that. You need to be very aware in terms of what are their particular interests. So basically what I'm saying is that even the truth, this is not a post-truth kind of thing, but the truth, I think, objectively has multiple versions. Objectively has multiple versions because different people have very different interests and arguments that they want to push, and different political spectrums that they have. So I think that we should debate then to train ourselves in becoming better people, because in BP, you will be put in these 4 benches, in which it gives a bit more complexity in terms of whether you agree or not with a certain policy, agree or not with a certain issue, but also how are you going to agree, in which perspective do you want to be in. And I think this is really good because in BP, you are able to experiment that and try to empathize with different actors and stakeholders that are involved in a particular issue and try to understand their position, not in a noble, empathetic way only, if you're actually that good of a person, for instance, but also to know in negotiations and things like that, what are the buttons to push of these different individuals and different stakeholders? What do we need to offer to them in order for us to gain progress? So I think BP in general, I think I've only adopted these kinds of mindset afterwards, where I go into some like open competitions and I don't have like burden at all to win. I really try to do this, and sometimes it will end up in terms of like really weird extensions. But I don't suggest you to do that because you're also, say, being paid by your university maybe to go to JOVED. But I think this is something that you should open your mind to. Sometimes it's better to have weird extensions in the intention of trying to learn more about who are the people that are actually impacted by this motion, but people don't talk about, for instance, or what is a point of view that people don't really talk about and is actually important, for instance, and maybe get forth, but you get a learning experience. Maybe it's a good idea to do this, for instance, if you're opening really smash it and all of the general arguments already there, rather than try to frame your way out of it and have weird strategies and rebuttals. Maybe you should, sometimes you might want to try to experiment with arguments. This is, of course, not always feasible, seeing that you still need to win those resistance because you still have responsibility towards your institution. But this is a strategy when you really are out of strategy. Try to have this mindset. I'm training myself. What if someday I have a position? Maybe you don't even have to later work in government, for instance. You work in NGO, you work in consultants, you work as lecturers, whatever, you will face situations where you have to balance different interests and to try to know who are the people that have this particular interest and understand what they truly want. And this is a good way to exercise of every round. At the very least, I have learned on and at least become a little bit better in trying to understand different perspectives. And I think this particularly is not, this is the first part in terms of like how you construct your case, but this is even more important in terms of how you engage in debating, because I've learned this in a hard way in my activism days, that sometimes in negotiations with multiple actors, misrepresentation of what they actually want, because we assume that, oh, okay, that's what they want, without really it are fatal. It kind of messes up the whole goal of what are the, I'm not going to the details because a lot of them are classified, but basically it may strain relationships between different parties. It may cause them to not want to work together with you anymore, things like that. misrepresentations are fatal. And I think it should also be something that is more talked about in debating. Because I think me with VM always complains this a lot, especially in international tournaments, because often our cases are misrepresented by opponents. What do I mean by being misrepresented? Like they only take some sound bites from our arguments and say that in a very uncharitable way that we're actually protecting something and we're not explaining why in reality we're explaining it. Things like these lingos, which I often are also victim of, like, but we have no response at all, for instance, or they give no structural reasonings why that's the case. These are lingos that I think are dangerous, because what if the judge is really good? What if the judge, because previous road to JOVED is with UPI, what if the judge is UPI and UPI takes notes really well, and then you say that there's no structural explanations, no response at all, but there is actually a response, and there is actually a structural explanation on their arguments, and their arguments are still standing. At that point, misrepresentation is not only annoying for your opponent, but can backfire for you in debates where the judges are good. And I hope judges are good because they already watch UPI's video later in JOVED. This usually happens because we focus too much in terms of strategy. We try to frame in terms of our team will win this debate because we are more important, and take the shortcut in terms of framing out and kicking out different benches. We focus more in terms of our content because we want to be different, and we don't spend time in terms of as much time as we should listening towards the opponents, and I'm also often guilty of that. But this is something I think that should be a cultural shift in terms of how debating should be. So basically, we need to learn to listen better, and I think this is something that is never thought actually. I mean, I debated 7 years. I had different coaches in different spectrums of debating, but I think the emphasis of listening and testing whether or not you actually have good retention of opponents' speeches is not something that is popular, I would say. Our training regimes, for instance, regimens, are often about speech, are often about training. We have things like verbatim, for instance. Some of you might have verbatim assignments in terms of typing down, but that's verbatim, and you have all the time in the world. But the question is, if there is a 7-minute speech of your opponent, can you really retell it in its complete form? I think even judges that do not have to write, their own points often fail, as Upi have said in his seminar, that basically judging quality is not that stellar yet. But imagine for people who are competing, who are under pressure and have to write their own extensions, and all of their inputs and personal constructive have always been about their own speech, their manner, their structure, and things like that. They need to focus on that. At the same time, they need to listen. I think what happens in terms of culture in debating today is that people then take the shortcut. Take the frame out, take the strategies, rather than really listening to what opponents' points and what are they trying to talk about. And I also I'm also guilty of that. So I'm not speaking in a position of you guys should be like this. I'm also like that. So basically, what I think that in this age of like framing counterintuitively, the best debaters, I think, are the one that respond to the truest and best versions of other benches. I think this is similar in terms of in activism, in negotiations, and in discussions with communities and stakeholders. We need to be attentive and really take them and at their best. It's not like sometimes we use this lingo. We're going to be generous and take the other team at their best, but what people are doing sometimes are just making up scenarios in terms of, I think that their best version of their arguments is like that, right? But I do see that the best debaters amongst us, I think that maybe if I name a few, for instance, like Rifan or Satrio, for instance, in the moments where I debate against them, sometimes I'm surprised at how much they actually are willing to respond towards the details and the truest versions of the arguments, even when I feel that I was, convoluted in the way that I was saying these particular arguments. But when I debate against the people that I really respect in terms of how they debate, they would often respond it in terms of the truest and best versions of what I'm trying to say. What's the essence of it, rather than like the strategy part of it. And I think this is something that we all need to have more realization of in terms of when we enter this particular debate. We actually have to be respectful towards the opponents. I know that there are rivalries within debating communities. I know that there are pressure to win, but sometimes to at least feel a bit better about yourself, regardless of the result of your rounds, it would be really good if we have a culture where it is about respecting the opponents. It is about hearing them out and having good faith to them that they actually have very meaningful contributions, and you should respond that meaningful contribution as best as you can as a form of respect towards their points. And this form of respect towards the opponent is something that I think in activism is something that's very important, because you don't want to fuck up. Basically, you want to make sure that the deals go well, but also in debating, counterintuitively respecting opponents on the floor would make your speech much better, because the quality of your rebuttals would be better because you're rebutting the best versions of your opponents and opposing benches arguments. So I think that in general, maybe the question would be, but if we're charitable towards the opponents, then that's bad, because we're not pointing out their mistakes, for instance. Sure, I think pointing out mistakes, for instance, going to judges and say, notice that their elaboration is very low, notice that they've never given any counter mechanism, things like that, the usual lingo that we use, is sometimes important, especially if the mistakes are fatal and you think that the judges might not realize it. But in reality, judges usually realize them. And we rarely see a judge would say that, oh, you lost it with a particular debate because you didn't point out that the arguments are not as well structured or are not as complete. But often we lose not because of failing to point out, but basically failing to respond, right? Almost all decisions in terms of deciding fourth, third, second, first is about which points are still standing. And basically, if it still stands, that's the reason why you lose, because you failed to respond to a particular point. Never do you say that, oh, this team is actually kind of bad, but you didn't point it out, so you rank below them. Never. So I think that this preoccupation into framing and preoccupation to pointing out others' mistakes should be lessened, because I know that it is important to point this out sometimes if you feel the judges might not realize it, but in reality, it takes up airtime for you to actually go deep in terms of responding the point genuinely. So I think this is the lesson that I learned, because sometimes we are busy with our own ideas, we're busy with our own cases, we're busy with our own trying to win, and like, the faces that we make in our benches, and we hear weird points like unfailing and giving POIs in an obnoxious voice, for instance, things like that. We often do and fall trap to, because of the competitive, nature of debating. But really, they never cause us to lose. I mean, if we become decent people and we respect the points from other people, and we really listen to them carefully, I don't think that would be a reason to lose. It would be a reason to win, because the quality of our speeches and the quality of our responses would be much higher. Okay, that's basically the first part, right? So I talked about why we should then debate. I talked about how then we balance and listen to different interests, and why BP is particularly important, because you have to listen to the other three branches really carefully, and realize what are their strongest points. And now I'm to the last part in terms of providing context. I think that the experience. Wait. Am I losing connection? No. Okay. So basically, there are three prongs, I think, in terms of what are the contexts that you can bring in relation to both debating and also activism. The first is a vivid story, because I think that in a debate where there are a lot of logical argumentations being thrown away, left and right, different scenarios, best case, worst case, and things like that, what kind of can become the tipping point is when you bring something that's real, as in real vivid experience. Some coaches might say, you shouldn't bring a personal story in terms of debating, but sometimes judges just need that nudge of more, conviction in terms of which are the scenarios that are actually real and believable. Because oftentimes judges will say, I don't think that's a believable argument, for instance. This is, what judges often use when they have to make a judge call. I think it's more persuasive for this team, or more realistic for this team to bring this. And I think we can tap into that judge call metric by trying to give vivid stories in terms of the way that we give context. This could be something that's really serious, like, right? So I think, for instance, explaining the extent of harm in a very vivid manner can really help, not only in terms of manner, but also in terms of what this actually really happens on the ground. For instance, how tortures are being done in prisons. For instance, how abuses towards children actually happen in poor communities. For instance, if you have experience in terms of talking with these people, that will be good. Or maybe not necessarily directly from your activism experiences, from books you read. For instance, I really admire this person called Brian Stevenson, which is a civil rights lawyer based in Alabama, who gets people out of death row in the US. You guys should read the book. It's called Just Mercy, one of his books. Basically, a vivid story would look something like, when it tells the story that the way that death row is being held is that they're often scapegoats in terms of police forces not being able to find a particular suspect for a murder, and they just snatch a random black person that has a clear alibi, but just snatch them and accuse that they are the murderers, just like that. And I think that just that vivid story, that single vivid story, already speaks volumes in terms of all the spectrums of injustices, in terms of how the police force operates and how the law system operates in the US. Because in that one story, you have racial injustice, you have basically no presumption of innocence at all, you have no evidence and things like that, but it still happened legally. So I think that story in itself creates, sometimes arguments that are shocking may be accused as being conspiratory. So maybe sometimes opponents or judges will say that it sounds like really conspiratory that the law system would conspire to do that, or say in other contexts that businesses would conspire that much. Like another vivid story, for instance, would be that there is collusion basically within the food industry in the US, right? And around the world, where basically United States, Dietary Agency, United States Cancer Association, United States Diabetes Institution, and all of these things are being funded by food corporations. And I think that it's if you simply say that, right now food industry have massive lobbying power, and they can control the diet of people. Sounds conspiratory, but when you tell this, literally the sponsors of American Diabetes Institution are a lot of them food companies that sell a lot of products that are bad for diabetes. Things like processed meat, for instance, that also has high fat levels, that is actually a very high, in terms of diabetes, is also caused by whether or not the sugar is being, the sugar is I forgot basically what's the language, but basically fat also, a lot of research also says that a lot of these things also apply to diabetes, also apply to cancer, for instance. Like processed meat, researchers have shown that processed meat actually have level 1 carcinogen, which is the same as cigarettes. So these are vivid stories that you know, okay, cancer is also caused by processed meat industry, and strong studies have shown, even like Harvard studies have shown that the level of carcinogenics is basically the same as cigarettes, for instance. But they are being funded. The American Cancer Institute is being funded by them, and even have recipes within their website in terms of healthy diets that tells you to eat bacon basically as one of the healthy recipes. Same for American Heart Disease Association and so on. So basically what I'm trying to tell you is that these kinds of stories really turn something that sounds conspiratory and only logically makes sense into something that this actually happens vividly, and you can actually see how gross it is in the world. It also can be something that's less serious in terms of like the urgency and the gravity of it. For instance, I had a debate about how cancel culture basically is really bad in terms of activism and activist organizations. I forgot the exact motion. I think VM gave me this motion for like a training session with the staff kids. Basically, what I thought of was an example of how bad, you know, this kind of policing, you know, self-policing of activist organizations, of trying to make sure that everyone has exactly the same arguments and cancel everyone that doesn't have the same argument as them, would lead into bad things. So that's basically the motion. And I remember in terms of how activist organizations operate, they often have very strong historical attachments towards a very narrow and rigid form of ideas in activism. So for instance, a lot of leftist organizations on the ground, for instance, are really do romanticize you know, past brutal regimes of you know, communism, for instance, and really shames anyone that doesn't agree with why past, you know, communist glory, for instance. And I thought of like one of the examples. I went to you know, kind of leftist feminist meeting, and in you know, kind of a lecture and discussion about patriarchy, it itself devolved into a discussion about why North Korea is actually a very good government, and we need to respect them, and how all medias right now are basically defaming them. I think that really shows in terms of a vivid story about how deeply rooted like historical attachments towards rigid ideologies and in activism is manifested, and you know, how it also seeps into discussions that even does not have any relation towards what's the topic, but because they are very rigid in terms of, you know, leftism is something that's always correct, so they go towards that extent even in scenarios where it's kind of weird to talk about it suddenly, very, you know, very uncorrelatingly with the topic, which is like how patriarchy is and how do we solve it, right? So that's that. Another vivid story would probably be, I had a debate with VM in IIUM Open, and we had to argue whether or not real estate companies are able to, whether or not real estate companies have the obligation to provide and build and develop, you know, affordable public housing, cheap housing towards people or not, as a prerequisite for them to get their license. And a vivid example would be to explain why the houses would be really bad if they're being built by private developers that is only doing this for for getting a license, I think one of the best way to do that is giving examples. Because if we're trapped in the debate whether or not the standard or quality is good, then the other team will say you can get regulations, you can have standards in terms of room sizes, you can have standards in terms of building materials, you can have standards in terms of air quality, and all of these things that are tangible and are enforceable. So definitely the quality won't be as bad, right? But I think if in giving examples, for instance, in my days of activism for like good public housing, I often try to find examples where things fall out, right? So like legit examples of how the non-quantifiable parts of design of a particular public housing is something that's very affecting. A good vivid story would be the story of Prut Ego housing in the United States, in which it is a good building. It has, you know, good materials. It's not too cramped like Hong Kong, even better than Hong Kong, for instance, in terms of like the square meters of the places. But the design is so that the way that it is designed, it doesn't really put into account how people move around the building, and the hallways allocations and how the houses are being put next to each other basically alienates people and put a lot of blind spots within the building. And what happened is the building become a place of crime because of the design. A lot of criminal gangs start to grow there because simply people don't feel comfortable living there and start to abandon it while it's a perfectly good building. And also there's a lot of blind spots where these criminal organizations can then thrive, to the point where the public housing is forcefully demolished, like really big towers even of concrete buildings being destroyed simply because it had non-well thought of design, even though in like any quantifiable metric that would be a good public housing. So this story, I think, really shows then that you really need to do the things that are intangible in terms of providing public housing. You need to do the good public consultation and participation with the owners of the houses and the inhabitants of the houses to make sure that the house is good, because no amount of regulatory standards of housing quality or like procedures would actually be meaningful in terms of making sure that the design is actually good and livable. And I think that the story of Prut Ego, or maybe other than Prut Ego, also told stories where and in the ground in Indonesia, a lot of rusuns or public housings are being abandoned, not because that it's bad, but simply because it's far from the places that they work, or simply because it is the design itself and the hallways, it has a very different feel in terms of their previous houses which is usually in slum areas in the middle of the city. So that kinds of nuances and context that are often unregulatable is important, and people would leave the houses if they feel that those intangibles are not to their liking. So that's an example of how to use a vivid story rather than just parameters of square meters, then parameters of whatever parameters of light quality and things like that, materials and things like that. You cannot basically regulate this, and like how easy it is for these real estate companies then to simply have like a subpar design because they're only doing it for the license, and you cannot enforce it. So that's one of the example of how a vivid story would help. The second thing is surprising statistic, because often what you need to do to catch people's attention is to have surprising statistics that is very not only surprising but very convincing. For instance, I think back to Brian Stevenson, one of the statistics that he always says when he gives lectures, for instance, would be that the error rate of death row in the United States is basically for every 10 or 9 death row inmates, one of them would be innocent. Not only, I mean, like completely innocent. Not only that their sentences should be lower than death row, but literally innocent, doesn't have any crime. So that's a good way of saying that if we were to have if we were to design an airplane, right, for instance, and the statistics that for every 9 takeoffs, then they would crash and burn and kill everyone on board, we would never apply that design for the aviation industry, but we somehow apply this for the law system, and we don't really talk about it that much, right? So I think these are examples of really powerful statistics and examples that you would get more to know of if you kind of read more in terms of and follow more different kinds of researchers and activists that's really devoting their life into these particular things. Another example that kind of just shocked me like a few days ago would be how peer-to-peer lending in Indonesia, for instance, when I was researching about like how do we empower communities to build their own businesses and things like that. Like a lot of peer-to-peer lending businesses, like one of them in Indonesia, for instance, really tries to be like, microfinancing for the poor, right? But as I realized and take a look at the statistics and really count the statistics, the interest rates for the borrowers in villages that want to start like small businesses of farming or small businesses of whatever in villages, of opening up a shop, of creating a construction small company and things like that. It's quite crazy because like it's like flat 30% for these kinds of borrowers, which is of course understandable because like these peer-to-peer lendings want to gain profit, and it's very risky to invest in terms of like poor people in villages, so they want to have a large margin of error, right? So that's why they're imposing this amount of interest towards these towards these borrowers in villages, which is like really kind of messed up if I think and like if you run the numbers, it's like in terms of the numbers of these peer-to-peer lendings interest rates, it is maybe if calculated into a flat interest rate around 7 times compared to if these people have conventional lenders in terms of starting up their businesses. Of course, in reality, people would say that, well, peer-to-peer lending is good in terms of making sure that these people have access to begin with, because like conventional creditors won't even give them any credit, right? Because their credit ratings are bad. But what you need to realize is it really then the solution for us to just let these companies loose and have strict regulations in terms of how much the interest rates are for these particular poor individuals in countrysides and villages? Shouldn't we be fixing the system instead, rather than giving like startups and companies to do that for us? These things like that, yeah, like surprising statistic of this is 7 times higher in terms of the interest rate conventional lenders, is something that's very powerful in terms of saying that this peer-to-peer lending seems really good, seems bringing people access to banking towards the unbanked basically, but at what cost, right? Also, so surprising statistics like that. Lastly is basically cushions for opponents. I think that reading a lot and having and engaging in activism a lot is very good, because oftentimes in activism you need to directly counter whatever the strong media narrative that is harmful. So you would directly go in terms of seeing what their interests are. Now, I had an interesting conversation with in like an internal forum. We invited, if you know Andita Afutami or Afutami, basically she's a researcher on environmental economist in World Bank, and also like one of the founders of Think Policy Indonesia, which you guys should see, because it gives a lot of context about Indonesian politics and Indonesian governance and how the parliament works and things like that, which is very good. But outside of that, I had a discussion about, basically she said that it's important in everything to always give cushions towards your opponents, as in you need to convince them that their interests are being catered, basically cushions for them to be comfortable in terms of negotiating further things. Then basically I asked her in terms of like, okay, you're an economic environmentalist. You always bring arguments about there are huge externalities costs in terms of forest fires, or in terms of flooding, and things that are caused by environmental destruction in the name of economy actually has also very negative economic impact. But people doesn't seem to get that, right? Destruction will still happen. Why is that the case? And what she said was, for me, quite interesting, because what she said was, okay, that's not exactly a question for your opponent, because your opponent is not economy. Your opponent is basically the businesses and the private sector. And those economic harms of forest fires is only economic harms for the public. Basically, it's a public harm, but not a private harm, because they can afford to move away from these particular places. They can afford hospital bills, maybe from respiratory diseases and things like that. They have no problem about it. So you need to really tailor the context that you bring to which actor are you trying to convince or you're trying to question, because it's not as simple as we need to bring arguments that are pro-economy because our governments right now are pro-economy. It's much more complex than that, but rather it should be who rules the government right now in particular, and what are their particular interests they want to cater. And one of the things that she said is that rather than just saying that this is a huge economic harm, we should make it a business opportunity for these businesses. So she said, why don't we have carbon trading as something that we always advocate for, because and frame it in a way that says that corporations have all of this unused land with all of these trees. Why not convince them to maintain those trees in order for them to get revenues from carbon trading, right? So these kinds of contexts in which we realize that actually which policies that we should choose, which arguments and narratives should we choose, can have a very specific context for which actors we're trying to convince. So I think that's really good in terms of realizing that we can't have general economic arguments. We need profit arguments, and what are environmentally profitable things, not just externalities of these particular things, but how do we make sure that they realize that there is a potential of profit from maintaining the environment, and that profit comes from if we advocate more for carbon trading and how carbon trading can be beneficial and targeted towards the most harmful kinds of large corporations. So those are examples of how context, I think, really helps, both in terms of real activism, because you choose which kind of context you convey and which kind of context you don't show, right? And vice versa. But also, last example is also about, this is maybe more to activism rather than debating, but sometimes you also have to choose to withhold information. A good example of this is in how the COVID cases are right now. We have vaccines, right, being developed, but if the vaccines are not tested enough, then we are at a risk that it would be faulty batches, because the testing only are for 6 months, and there might be side effects that we have not realized because it actually needed a year for them to manifest, for instance. But at the same time, we have a lot of anti-vaxxers in society. And if we cast doubt in terms of what the vaccines are, then it also makes the anti-vax stronger. And the vaccines would be a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms that it wouldn't work because not everyone uses it, and we do not go to the threshold of herd immunity that we need. So these kinds of dilemmas in terms of which context do we want to convey to our society, and how are we going to convey it so that they get the sufficient and the optimal amount and kind of information for them to make the best decisions, something that's important. You need to be selective in terms of which context we bring, because sometimes we have to agree that some contexts are true, but if it's set in a context of discussion that is unsuitable, then it would have really bad consequences, like the casting doubt towards vaccines thing, which would be terrible in terms of saying that in Aceh as a precaution, then because they already have a very strong anti-fact base, and saying that in Aceh would mean that the vaccine wouldn't work at all, regardless of whether or not it is a faulty batch or not. So these kinds of realization and understanding of different contexts, in having a vivid story, in having a surprising statistic, and having specific questions for people in debating maybe the opponents, but in general for the people you're trying to target, are all things that are very important. And you can really always train and kind of hone your ability to pick and choose different contexts and remember different contexts and remember how to tell them convincingly, both in real life, in negotiations and activism, or also in debating. It would be something that's very beneficial for you moving forward. So I think it's good for you to see JOVED not only as a competition, but for you to see JOVED as basically a training ground where you can experiment and get feedbacks from judges, get feedbacks from your teammates and your coaches upon whether or not you're already using all of your arsenals of knowledge correctly, and how do you present them suitably. So I think that's it for the things that I want to say first. Maybe after this, we would have like a bit of a chat with VM. Maybe there's some things that VM wants to talk about more in detail.
Yeah, you can take down the share screen. Yeah, let's have the chat.
I can't really hear you. Wait.
Can you hear me, Ilham?
Still a bit putus-putus.
Test. Hello? Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes.
Great. You can take down the share screen and we can have our chat.
Okay, wait.
Right. So from your presentation, I've got a couple of questions that I'm interested to know on. So firstly is on how exactly does this activism mindset impact your debating? Like, how do you feel when you are demanded by a motion to defend an opinion that is so radically different than yours? Does being an activist, does that prevent you from being able to perform at your A game? Or does it eventually help you as well because you're able to see the other side? Or how does it go? Because I think like there are lots of people that faces challenges when they are demanded to defend an ideology or a motion that is so far detached from their personal perspectives.
Okay, so basically there are stages and spectrums in this. The first stage would be before when I had this conflict, I wasn't really involved in activism that much. I didn't really understand the importance of actually knowing the other side. So the first stage is simply knowing which buttons to push, as I've said. This is something that's important and still will be something that's self-interested, because in reality, speaking about this gives you a better understanding of your opponents and a better in real world, right? And a better understanding of your opponents in the real world are more likely for you to bring convincing arguments in the real world. So that's the first thing. So I think that as you be more involved in activism, as you turn from simply third-person spectator that have your own personal ideas to I actually have the position and ability to write things, to voice out things that may make a difference, even though a little, you start to realize that this is part of the job, that it's part of the job for you to be really someone that's participating in society, to understand all of these spectrums of points. So I think that's what makes me more and more comfortable in terms of talking about things that I don't agree with, because I know at the very least now it forces me to understand better the other side and know which weak points that they have, or which questions, as I said, are appropriate for them if we were to want to make actual changes there. But in the kind of more transcendence level kind of thing, I think basically sometimes we may be wrong. sometimes our personal opinions may be wrong. Like me and Michael, for instance, have a lot of difference in opinions in terms of, for instance, whether or not I'm for instance, like I had a really interesting conversation with VM in the past about TERFs, right? Trans exclusionary radical feminists, right? Priorly, my position would be really real because of how biased I am and my social circles and the things I read. I wouldn't see like the objective argumentations about what that turf has, right? But it was only open, and I genuinely think now that although I don't agree with them entirely, but I understand that there are things that are point out that are fair. I wouldn't realize that if I weren't to do debating and actually discuss and debate about turf, right? So taking that initial step of putting myself in a position that I don't agree with, sometimes not only for the sake of, you know, using this as a tool to convince the other side and to push their weak points, but we sometimes actually gain better understanding and reevaluate our positions in life. Because as I said, life is very complex, and sometimes these positions change in very different spectrums. So this is also an exercise on reevaluating myself and my positions in things, and how it is never actually rigid, but your stances would always evolve over time.
Thank you so much. I think that's very, very enlightening. Another question that I have is that now that you are an activist, and I think you always read a lot, even before your activism days, do you feel like the on-the-ground knowledge that you are currently having from all your activism, from your meetings with many different stakeholders inside of the activism world, well, does that aid your debating, or does it create its own problems? Like, I don't know, I feel like to a certain extent, and this is something that we often discuss as well, we often really dislike it when people are not being realistic in their cases, when they're detached from reality. And do you think that now that you are closer to reality than most debaters are, because you are actually doing, you know, the hard part, which is bringing the changes that we talk about in debate chambers into the real world, do you think that now all those on the ground knowledge that you have in your head, does that make you even more disillusioned to the entire sport, or like does it, you know,
Okay.
invigorate you or whatnot?
Okay. So as I said, now the way that I see debating is more of first is of course about the friends and communities, right? But it kind of what kept me getting back is because of that. But also I think that, as I said, debating then becomes now changes for me. It then becomes a training ground, because now I see the parallels, and now my takeaways after a debating competition would be, what did exactly I learn from that? What are the points that I learned from all of these opponents with differing point of views and different life experiences can actually bring to me. So I think that, you know, of course there is this illusionment, especially I think in very competitive rounds, especially I think we have this bias against like Westerners talking about our conditions in the East, for instance, and things like that. This disillusionment exists, and disillusionment also, of course, becomes worse, but it's more of towards like the individuals, right? As you said, we get annoyed by teams that are detached from realities. But to be honest, sometimes we also fall into that trap. And I think that the way I see it now, I kind of basically it just makes me take debating less seriously, not in a bad way, but I mean like now I know that both in debating and also actually on the ground, because you said that, you know, I'm doing the hard part in terms of making changes. In reality, I am not making any changes at all, because it's as difficult as and as gray as what happens in a debating chamber, right? Because there's just so many actors involved, because there are so many powers outside of our control, and I think that being an activist, a student activist in particular, not people. I'm not someone that works in LBH and handles actual legal cases. I'm not someone that works in WAHI that actually goes towards actual, you know, sites of environmental distractions. I'm simply a student activist that tries to amplify these voices, which is also a learning experience and kind of a meta experience that is that is maybe slightly more intertwined to reality than the debating sport, but it is same ways also somewhat of a simulation and learning experience too, if you get what I mean. So now I think the position of debating also changes for me as I attach more with realities, in terms of I used to be so disillusioned and hate it so much, but now I'm kind of neutral about it, the same way that I'm neutral with my experience as a student activist, because being a student activist also comes with its own disillusionment, right? Because we're simply saying these things and publishing these researches, publishing these infographics simply because we have to as a student activist body, right? But are we really making changes? The same question also arises. So what I get from getting closer to reality is that I understand more how everything I think should be treated as preparations for the future of bettering yourself in terms of being better listeners, of forcing yourself to read more, forcing yourself to understand others' perspectives more. uh, I think the way that the reality kind of comes in debating is that now I'm able to detach more of my like self-worth and like achievement orientation away from debating, because in reality we all have really long lives, right? It is a bit getting a bit more philosophical, but we all have long lives, and basically we're not obligated at all to be impactful in reality and on the ground from right now on the get-go, because everyone trains and everyone studies first. You will get better positions, you will become professionals, you will become maybe public officials, and even like the best presidents, say for instance, agree or disagree, I also disagree with a lot of his policies, say Obama for instance, he only got to actually make real changes when he's like what, 50, right? So I guess now what reality have actually taught me is that it's okay to not be able to bring changes in the debating chamber, but what debating chamber gives is an opportunity for you to better yourself and learn more, for you to be able to make changes in the future, maybe not now but later, when we're more experienced, later when you've gained the knowledge and the positions that enable you to make those changes that are meaningful.
Yeah. All right. I understand. That's actually very, very enlightful. Last question. Do you have any particular advices that you want to give to everyone that's planning to join JOVED, or perhaps any other major debating tournaments, people that are going to be watching this video?
Okay. It's kind of already intertwined in my second thing, but basically what I'm trying to say is that this oftentimes it will sound corny, but it use this competition as a learning experience. That's basically always what coaches say after saying that you need to win, blah blah blah. You need to fix on things. Coaches will also always say, but also treat this as learning experience. But I think that phrase goes a bit deeper. In terms of this is not just learning experience for the next competition, because like all debating competitions, I think even until the end is a learning experience. I think, of course, if you're talking about careers, right? I I guess it's true that winning JOVED would better your CV. But if you talk about whether or not you can get something of an objective benefit that you need to bring for your livelihood, for instance, or things like that, oftentimes it's not necessarily the competing part, but oftentimes the judging part, right? The judging part is what gets you money. But like you don't really get money from winning all the competitions there is, right? You win JOVED, I don't know, do you get prize money in this JOVED?
You
Do you
get
get prize
trophy.
money?
You get trophy.
You get trophy, right? So there's no really objective thing to fret about. Like I objectively need to win this for good outside of prestige, which can be built in like many different CVs experiences other than going to JOVED. So I think really take more seriously when people say to you, take this as a learning experience, because if you go round by round and learn things out, not just about the debating strategies and debating techniques, but also the life lessons that you learn from debating motions and hearing different opinions from others, I think that really pushes you and empowers you to go to the next round, regardless of the results, better, because you know that it doesn't matter that I get fourth in this round. I learned this and I want to apply it, or I want to understand more in the next round. So that would be my advice towards everyone that's joining. I know that and I know that this is important for many aspiring debaters, because of course winning JOVED or having good results in JOVED, but if you get CVs will lead you to get good good work opportunities, or both inside debating as in like judging and CAing, but also outside, because you won national competitions and things like that. But really, if you're talking about like those kinds of credentials, there are lots of means and opportunities for you to chase it, and you can only truly chase it if you learn something from this. And I think that's the corny typical advice I would bring. Treat this a learning experience, but now realize that this is deeper than just like prepping for the next competition, but this is about in general how you approach life. And like JOVED can be very meaningful, because in no other opportunity, you rarely get opportunities such as national tournaments in debate, where you have like rounds and rounds of debate, where you always talk about different things that impact your lives, and you constantly reevaluate your positions in life, and you constantly reevaluate your abilities to listen to others, your ability to speak clearly and respectfully, and things like that, like a debating competition, right? So it's basically whole 2 days or 3 days where you constantly look into yourself and see your positions on issues, and see your positions on how you should communicate with others and things like that. So I think this is, regardless of result, a very valuable experience for you to have, genuinely I say, and you can learn a lot from this. So this really is and actually improves your if in the end you want to perform well, it also improves your performance, because I think VAM also can vouch for this. I think nerves really impacts. I think our performances, both in like, especially in Worlds, I think were negatively impacted by the amount of pressure we have. Right, like the more we have dire numbers of VPs, the worse our performances were. Even though we thought that in previous competitions in this same motion we would have been much better in terms of our delivery in our case, but because of that element of pressure, we have like so little VPs and we might not break, then our case become like really shit. So I think that use this as a learning experience, but also even if you want to win, having that mindset helps you to perform better and get rid of the pressure that will negatively impact your performance.
All right. I suppose that will be it. Thank you so much, Ilham. It is really enlightening.
Yeah, thank you for inviting.
Yeah. We wish you all the best of luck for your activism.
Amen.
Yeah, thank you for continuing being a debater that really inspires people and really walking the talk. And
Amen.
All the best, my friend.
Okay, thank you. All the best for JOVED. Good luck for everyone participating. Good luck for the ORCOM. Good luck for everyone.
To all of you who are watching at home, thank you for tuning in to the third Road to JOVED. Road to JOVED is sponsored by Telkom Indonesia. We hope to see you in future Road to JOVEDs, and we hope to see you in JOVED as well. Link on how to register to JOVED down below. Thank you very much.